Thanks everyone for coming on today. I'm standing in for Suhail, who's unavailable. Yeah, I'm Ewan Pennington. I'm also at ECMWF, working a bit in machine learning for the AIFS, our artificial intelligent forecasting system. But today, for the seminar, we have Gab Abramowitz, who's a professor at the Climate Change Research Centre at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, and is broadly interested in how computational models of natural systems can be used for inference about those systems. He's been using machine learning for a long time, for over 20 years, so he's definitely got a lot more on me there. I've only been using it for the last sort of 4 or 5, so it's yeah, I'm one I'm a hips. I'm trying to cling on the coattails, but yeah, and he's got other interests, including ensemble generation, interpretation and post-processing, model independence assessment, weighting and bias correction approaches, downscaling and impacts prediction, and sort of interests in the nature of calibration, relationship between model development, training, and its application and testing, and what the manipulation of this relationship between can tell us about models and their discrepancies in the real world. So yeah, thanks a lot, Gab, for agreeing to talk, and I'll hand it over to you now to take the floor. Thanks.
No worries. Thanks, Ewan. I'm hoping everyone can hear me. Do ping if you can't. I will share my screen and go full screen. Yell at me, Ewan, if you can't see everything. I'm going to try and hide this.
No, it looks great. Yeah, we've got it full screen
Awesome.
now.
Awesome. Cool. So I'm obviously going to talk to you about machine learning benchmarking of land models. And to start that off, I want to have a little think about, let me just get this happening, the way we normally think about land models working, and that is we're sort of having meteorology coming in at a particular time. From the previous time step, we're feeding in model states. We produce states for this current time step. We have outputs, fluxes to the atmosphere, fluxes to the surface at this time step, and we've got time independent parameters that come in. This shouldn't be unfamiliar to you, perhaps laid out in a slightly different way, but this is sort of the way we think about it. And I want to try to convince you that for the purposes of benchmarking, and when I'm talking about benchmarking, I'm really trying to focus in on how do we make land models better and how do we know how to make land models better. I think a representation like this is a little more helpful where we've got sort of the things coming into a land model, its domain, that's the meteorology, the surface parameters, and the previous time step states, but it's just a vector of numbers coming into a land model. And it has these outputs, which are states at the next time step and the fluxes to surface and atmosphere. But then we just have a mathematical function, and really the job is to try and work out when the things going into this function are right, when it's wrong at the other end, and what subset of that input space does it do a good job, and when does it not do a good job. So when we're evaluating a land model, we'd often look at, these things, these outputs that we're really interested in. We compare to observations and say, if the land model agrees, we've got a good land model. If a land model doesn't agree, we've got a bad land model. But it's obviously not quite that simple, and that's where this functional representation, I think, has some merit. Because if we have the wrong surface parameters, the mismatch is not necessarily about the land model. If we have the wrong meteorology, it's not necessarily about the land model being bad, and same thing for the states, obviously. And this is particularly obvious in the gridded simulation context. So in almost all gridded simulation cases, we have pretty poor model constraints. So trying to work out why something is going wrong in this environment is really hard. So first of all, our meteorological forcing is usually derived from an analysis product. And the forcing uncertainty is not particularly well known, or at least not quantified, or not quantified, and not quantified. Model parameters are typically prescribed with vegetation types and soil types. So the degree to which that describes the actual environment we're talking about is, we know that's not right, but the degree to which that matters, again, is not that well quantified. Initial states can't really be measured. And the things that we evaluate the model with at the gridded scale are also simply a kind of, I mean, not simply. There are guests that have observational constraint, but again, the uncertainties are typically not that well known. Add to that the fact that we have an evaluation time step that's typically pretty large, something like monthly data, so that we're not really looking at the ability of this function given the right inputs. We're really looking at the execution of this function looped upon itself many, many, many times, and we're looking at what the emergent biases might be as a result of that. So tracing that back to what's actually wrong in that functional representation can be really hard. So that is why I have ended up spending so much time with flux tower data. And it has its own problems too, which I'll get to, of course, but we definitely have very direct measurements with clear uncertainties of the meteorology. And I understand that the fluxes to the atmosphere are not directly measured, they're sort of inferred, but it's pretty close to a measurement. And the time step size of these measurements is basically the same as the time step size that we run the land models. Obviously, flux tower data is typically aggregated to kind of half-hourly time steps. We might run a land model at a smaller time step than that in a coupled context, but it's pretty close. So we can actually start to think about the land model as a function. Many of the vegetation and soil parameters can be directly measured. I've put a little question mark down here because we don't obviously get everything, but we have some constraint. We can actually go to the place and look at what we should be describing within the footprint of a flux tower. And we have some information about soil moisture and temperature and carbon stores. But again, it's obviously not perfect constraint. But we can have a better stab at quantifying the uncertainties in this environment. I guess more importantly for the machine learning context is more than hundreds of sites, we have millions of actual observations. We have a very large sample size, and that allows us to do some very cool things and uncover some rather disturbing results. But I would sort of contend that some of the stuff I'm going to show you is actually about the fact that we have the observations of the system that describe it really well, when many of the other modeling endeavors we engage with, we don't actually have that kind of constraint. So elephants in the room. I'm talking about flux tower data here. There are obviously quite a few issues with flux tower data. Conservation issues are very well documented. To get around that, we can look at raw and corrected fluxes, and I'll show you some results here with the FluxNet 2015 energy balance closure approach, which I don't think is correct, but it's something that we can look at, different ways of closing that budget. There are obviously low turbulence periods where we don't think the measurements are going to be particularly accurate, so we can filter out for low wind speed or based on U star. And there are obvious inconsistencies, and this is less about flux tower data and more about the modeling world we work in. There are inconsistencies between the real world and the model world. And an example of that, and this is from the Plummer 2 experiment, is these are sort of the axes you'd normally have on a Bodico curve, and a Bodico curve would sort of run along here somewhere, where on the horizontal axis I've got a dryness index, it's potential evapotranspiration over rainfall. So if you want, on the right of the one line here, we've got water limited sites, and left of the one line here, we've got energy limited sites. And on the vertical axis, we've got the fraction of rainfall that is expressed as evapotranspiration. So that's evaporative fraction in a hydrological sense. And the thing that's really weird about this plot is you can see about 30% of those sites seem to evaporate more than they get in rainfall. And if you know your land models, you know the land model can't do that. And so you might say, well, the data is clearly rubbish, but it's not actually. There's a lot that can happen under the ground. There can be groundwater availability, there can be channels under the ground, all sorts of things go on. Another hypothesis might be that this is because of things like energy conservation, but if we do energy conservation correction for all these sites, that problem actually becomes quite a lot worse. I wouldn't worry that sites are left of that one-to-one line, because that depends on how you decide to estimate potential evapotranspiration, and there are lots of ways to do that. So that is less concerning. But just to point out that the real world does not actually violate some of the assumptions that we make in these models. And we spent a lot of time in this paper talking about why we thought that was a real thing and not a data problem. So this leads on to using machine learning models as benchmarks in this context. So we can use machine learning to predict fluxes using meteorological variables, just like we do with the land model. We've got plenty of flux tower data, and we can use machine learning to tell us how much information the meteorology has about the fluxes as a proxy for predictability. So this is critical to this is obviously how we test it out of samples. So if we train the machine learning model on, and say, some sites and bring it to another site, we can start to understand how much predictability we can get from the meteorology at that site. So this leads to using machine learning models as benchmarks for land models, and we can understand a priori how well we should expect them to perform. And I mean, a priori, before I run my land model, what level of performance should I expect it to have? And that could be different for different circumstances. That could be different for different metrics, but using machine learning in this way allows us to use it in all of those contexts. So by varying the setup of the machine learning models and how we test them out of sample, we can create a hierarchy of performance levels to categorize land model performance. And to do that, we can vary things like obviously which variables we give empirical models or machine learning as predictors, the location and time period of training versus testing. So how far we go out of sample, do we go out of distribution, and what does performance look like when we do that? Obviously, how complicated the empirical models are. We could start with linear regression and go through to something much more complicated with internal states. We could allow lagged variables as proxies for physical model states as predictors into the machine learning, or actually just use machine learning algorithms with internal states. So setting up machine learning this way allows differing performance expectations depending on the complexity of the situation, the conditions and the location. So if you had a site, for example, that had really poor data quality, and you trained a machine learning model at another site and you tried to do a simulation at this site, it would do just as badly because it is saying that actually the information that I found at the other sites, the relationship between the meteorology and the fluxes is not holding at this site. So a little slide on why I think this is absolutely necessary. And I'm going to show you 3 images now which show one flux tower site, Metolius site in the US, and this is just an example, but it gives you an idea of why I think this is a critical issue. The black are the observations here. What we're looking at is net ecosystem exchange, 4 different seasons, and it's the average diurnal cycle for each one of those seasons. Black are the observations. The blue is a particular model, and you can see that model is tracking the seasonality. In the diurnal cycle, it's doing pretty well. If I look at the same model for average latent heat flux, now looking at monthly averages over all the years of the site, you can see it's getting the seasonality of latent heat flux. Now, if I look at sensible heat flux, a smooth time series of that, you can also see the model is capturing a huge amount of the variation in sensible heat flux. I would get away with, at almost any meeting in the world, saying, I have developed this fantastic new model, this blue model. It's one of the best in the world. And I could choose the images and the plots that I showed you to try and demonstrate that. But my point here is that blue model is actually just a linear regression against instantaneous sunlight. It's instantaneous shortwave down. And it's not trained with data from this site. So I've trained a linear regression that just instantaneously on the half-hour timescale takes shortwave down and tries to predict net ecosystem exchange, latent heat flux, and sensible heat flux, and I'm looking at different metrics for each of them. But just to point out that amount of variability in net ecosystem exchange, diurnal cycle, seasonal variation in latent heat flux, that kind of matching, visual matching of time series is just about the sun. It has nothing to do with vegetation. It has nothing to do with soil. It has nothing to do with any of the other driving variables. So visual correlation between curves shouldn't be the metric of how well a model performs. So the question then is, well, how well should we be expecting the model to perform? And that is the question that machine learning can help us to answer. Another big question that often comes up when using machine learning in a variety of contexts in our field is metrics involved, because machine learning is particularly good when you narrow the range of metrics you're looking at and you're just looking at one variable or one particular outcome and you have a very clear target metric. It can fit data very well. So to make this a little bit clearer, I'm actually going to look at what I'm calling an independent metric set. I've got 7 different, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different ones there. And they are an independent metric set in the sense that I can manipulate a time series to change just the outcome of just one of those metrics without affecting the other. And that's true for all of them. So that's what I mean by an independent metric set. And for each one of those metrics at each site, and let's take mean bias as the example, I am going to take a look at a hierarchy of simple empirical models out of samples. So they're all trained at other sites and then asked to make a prediction at a site they haven't seen. I'm going to take just this linear regression against shortwave down. You might expect that to do the worst. It might have the largest bias. Then I'm going to take a 27 node clustering algorithm of shortwave, air temperature and humidity, broken up into 27 clusters across all of the sites that I'm training on, and then do a linear regression at each one of those sites. So that gives me a piecewise linear reconstruction of my flux prediction based on just 3 of the instantaneous meteorological drivers. And the third one is to throw a full LSTM, which has internal states, at all of the meteorological variables, and that might do the best. And this is just a mock-up. This is not what's really going on. But the idea is that for each one of these metrics, I'm going to map the metric values onto the unit interval, where the best metric value of my 3 benchmarks on the left here, this is what I'm calling my benchmarks, my empirical model or machine learning benchmarks. I'm going to map the best and the worst of those to the unit interval. And then I'm going to give my land model a value in that unit interval, which allows for the possibility that my land model is better than all of those benchmarks, in which case I'll get a negative value, or that my land model is worse, in which case I'll get a value greater than 1. So I also don't mind if people want to jump in and ask questions. I have no problem with that. Well, I guess we'll get to questions at the end. Then I'm going to take the mean of this normalized metric value over many metrics and many sites. And that's what in the Plummer paper we called independent normalized metric value. So this lets us aggregate over lots of metrics, over lots of sites, even over variables if we wanted to. And what do results look like if I do that? So this is 154 sites. This is from the Plummer experiment over 7 metrics. Here is the Australian community land model called Cable. The red is the linear regression against sunlight, against shortwave down. The yellow is the shortwave temperature and humidity clustering algorithm, and the LSTM has all of the metadata given to it. Instantaneous metadata, but still just an instantaneous response. And as you can see, this land model does much, much worse than any of those for sensible heat prediction. That's the left column. Better than the linear regression for latent heat flux, but not better than the simple clustering against 3 of the predictors. And slightly better, nearly as good as the 3 predictor model phonetic system exchange. And Cable is not alone. This is Joules, which looks slightly worse than Cable. I assume most of you are familiar with the Joules model, the UK Met Office model. And if you look at the other land models that took part in this experiment, there's a pretty similar story. There's a lot of variation. They all do much, much worse for sensible heat flux, much, much worse than the linear regression against instantaneous shortwave. And averaged over all of the variables, no model beats a linear regression out of sample against instantaneous shortwave down. But a lot of them do beat it for 1 variable at a time. And you might say, well, that's because your flux tower data is not conserving. Well, if I redo the entire experiment and do that with conserving flux tower data using the FluxNet 2015 algorithm approach, I'd get different results. And for some models, it's better. So that's corrected. That's raw. That's corrected. That's raw. You're probably looking at your favorite model, and you may have noticed that some models are better and some are worse. It's definitely different, but it's not qualitatively different. If I do the same thing for wind speed above 2 meters a second, and this is basically knocking out a lot of the nighttime data, again, it's different, but it doesn't qualitatively change the picture. So the question is, what could be going on here? A few hypotheses. One is that our models are actually all perfect and we just can't prescribe our parameters well. So we have models with 40 or 50 parameters in them, and because we're using vegetation type and soil type and we can't actually go and measure the parameters, we're hamstringing our models. It's possible. I don't think it's true. I don't buy it, but it's possible. The flux tower data is systematically wrong. So this is not just about conservation. I showed you if we tried a different conservation approach or low turbulence, and not just about advection, because that would be particular to one site and not another. Remember, all of these empirical models are out of sample. They are being simulating at sites that they haven't seen in their training data. But there is a possibility that something about the way we measure flux tower data is systematically wrong at all of the sites. Again, possible, but I don't buy it. A third argument that's been made is that coupling is key, and that to get land models performing really well, we can only get that to happen in a single column model or a coupled environment, and they may be much better, and there's actually compensating biases with their host atmospheric model. Again, a possibility, but I don't buy it. I think this is much closer to the truth of what's going on in this situation. That the parameterizations that we have in our models, almost all of which, not all of which, almost all of which were developed before we actually had very much data at all. So I want you to have a little think about what it means to develop a physically based model when you don't have enough actual data to construct an empirical model. And my argument is that they're mechanistic rather than physically based. But if we have a whole lot of parameterizations in our model that are 90% right, say right 90% of the time, and we string 10 of those together, we end up with a model that's only right 30% of the time. And I think that is closer to where we're at, because we have a lot of empirical approximations, and the chances of them all being within their zone of best performance all at the same time is actually relatively low. So how could we decide which one of these is possible? The first thing I want to talk about is something called I've called domain analysis, and I've called it domain analysis because in this functional representation, this left, if you remember your first year mathematics, the left-hand side is called the domain, the right-hand side is called the codomain. So we're going to basically look at the domain space. We're going to look at which part of a forcing domain space, radiation, temperature, humidity, is poor land surface model performance most common. And to do that, I'm going to take the met forcing variables 2 at a time, divide each of them into 50 bins, and look at what happens to flux prediction in each one of those bins. So just as a rough example, if I look at air temperature and long wave down, there's this really pretty pattern that comes out with a low bias below the one-to-one line, roughly, and a higher sensible bias above the one-to-one line for sensible heat. So that is just a bias. We don't yet know that that bias is actually resolvable. We don't yet know that that bias isn't actually about data quality. So we want to go one step further. And by the way, that pattern is actually common to almost all of the land models. The top row here are empirical models. The ones below it are different land models. So that pattern is common across them. But what we really want to know is where we know the model can improve, where we know that machine learning can do better than the model, even though it's out of sample, which says we have demonstrated the capacity for an improved prediction. So I'm going to look for potential for improvement. And that is where there's a high proportion of time steps in one of these bins where the land model is outperformed by the three empirical models. So I'm going to take joules in this case, and I could do this for any model. And I'm going to call joules GL9 when the error magnitude out of joules GL9 is greater than the magnitude of the error from all three empirical models that I'm looking at. It doesn't really matter which ones I'm looking at here, but let's choose three empirical models of different structure so that it's not a fluke, it's not stochastic. All three of them are showing out of sample that there is more information than the land model is managing to utilize to get its prediction. Then I'm going to call that particular time step a joules GL9 loss, if that makes sense. And we're going to look at sensible heat. So the null expectation, if you imagine that joules GL9 is the worst model, out of 4 models, it will do that 25% of the time if it were random. So we'll make a color scale that, we'll give it the benefit of the doubt, plus or minus 5% here. If it's in this sort of bluey green color, it's doing well. If it's in this orangey red color, it's doing worse than if they were randomly spread. And that's what it looks like for the long wave down air temperature slice. So those bins that are dark red there are saying that in 95% of the time steps belonging to that bin, the land model is beaten by all three empirical models. So there seems to be a bit of an edge effect. Obviously, there are not many green cells there, but there is quite an edge effect going on. And if I slice with different met variables, it doesn't look quite as catastrophic, but there's definitely an edge effect going on. And in fact, if I look for other models, the patterns are quite similar across the models. So on the horizontal axis here, I have air temperature. It's common to all of these plots. The vertical column, we were just looking at joules GL9. They're different models from Plummer 2. These are all land surface models from Plummer 2. And the vertical axis, I've got what the relation 50 bins of air temperature versus 50 bins of LAI, of long wave down, of specific humidity, downwelling short wave, VPD, wind speed. And you can see that the downwelling long wave versus air temperature one is the one where we really show up that particular regions are showing up in a big way. And there's obviously a lot more to do. This is in a preprint. It's on the EGU preprint service. I've forgotten what it's called, EGU Sphere. It's a paper led by John Page if you want to look more. There's a little bit of an interesting pattern that happens with net system exchange. Only a few of the models submitted that to this experiment, but there definitely seems to be some kind of temperature dependence thing going on across the models. And just to be clear that actually if I take those Plummer plots on the vertical axis here where I've got this independent normalized metric value, these are the same three empirical models. I have my linear regression, my 3KM27, my cluster plus regression approach, and my LSTM. I can move my land model, which is this black line. And again, we've got sensible heat, latent heat, and net system exchange, which joules GL9 did not submit. I can move my land model from this black one down to this orange one by just knocking out those bins that you saw back here, these bins that are dark red. So the bins where I have more than 95% of the time the land model loses, if I knock those bins out, I can take my sensible heat independent normalized metric value from here to here, or I can take my latent heat from being in between the 3 cluster and the linear regression all the way down to being better than the LSTM just by taking out 13% of the time steps. So by identifying these specific sets of conditions, we can target, the idea here is to try and target information pathways through the land model that will result in better predictions. And we're demonstrating that by saying if we take out these particular bins, we can actually drop the performance. So if I take out the bins where I've got 95% or more of the machine learning models winning, I get that result. If I go to 50% of the time, the machine learning models are winning, then it's even more. But then I'm taking away, in the case of sensible heat, half of all the time steps. So that's not that surprising. Just to give you a quick look, if you've got a favorite land surface model as to what that does to different land surface models, most of them get a pretty healthy bump by taking out 10 to 15% of the time steps that are in those bins that do really badly. And this is now the bins in the 7-dimensional Met space rather than a projection down into the 2-dimensional Met space that we looked at before. Okay, so let's just have a look at time. So what do I think the solution is? I'll see if I can get through this relatively quickly and leave us some time for questions. I think we need an easy way for the community to access this kind of evaluation that lets us know where the capacity for improvement is. I think we need to compare new developments against a range of existing models. I think we need access to performance information as capacity for improvement. I think knowing about the model performance as a discrepancy with an observational product doesn't tell you whether you've done as well as you can do or whether you can do a lot better. Whereas if we can demonstrate with machine learning this capacity for improvement metric, then we know we can do better and we can start to identify the circumstances that we can do better. I think a community system that allows this broad range of metrics and allows us to evaluate multiple use cases of a model at once so that when we're developing, we can tell whether we break something is the kind of thing we need. And also has a fast evaluation turnaround. And that's the kind of thing I want to talk to you about now that we've been developing as part of the Australian community land surface modeling scene. So it involves 2 bits of technology, one called BenchCab and one called modelevaluation.org. I'll talk a little bit about each in a second. Modelevaluation.org is a web application. BenchCab is a Python script. And the use case goes something like this. You are developing a land model. You want to test what you've done. And you might want to compare it against a tag or the trunk or something like that. I nominate a test level. It might be a few flux tower sites. It might be a global simulation and do an evaluation with ILAM, or it might be this kind of evaluation with flux tower sites. I nominate up to 3 comparison branches, but in the simplest case, I might just say my branch and the trunk. What have I done that's changed this model? The BenchCab script automatically takes the branches that have been nominated, say the trunk head and my branch, and builds our land model for all of the configurations we might be interested in. We have up to 8. And then builds these 8x4 32 models and runs them at all of the sites or for the global simulation that we're interested in. It adds all of the metadata into the global attributes, the configuration information, the branch information, all of the nameless characteristics all end up in the netcity files. That bundle is pushed via an API to this web application into an appropriate benchmarking workspace. It decodes that, runs an analysis, and a URL is returned to the user that shows them essentially what the result of their change has been to the model in all the model configurations in terms of the change in this capacity for improvement metric. So I'm going to very, very quickly just take you there. So this is the web application. I'm hoping you can see that I've got quite a large monitor, so that might end up being quite small for you. Do shout if you can't see it.
No, it looks good, Gab.
Okay, awesome. So what we end up here with, this is that independent normalized metric. These numbers are that independent normalized metric. So as before, if you're in between 0 and 1, you're within the benchmark range. If you're greater than 1, you're worse than the benchmarks. If you're pink, you are worse than 3 times the benchmark. And if you are dark blue, you are better than the benchmark. Now, this is an evaluation at only 5 sites, so it's a very small sample size. But again, we have those 7 metrics, and we have the same 3 benchmarks. And the idea is here, I can see very clearly that sensible heat has a problem. For these 5 sites, we're doing pretty well for latent heat, not quite as well for kinetic system exchange. And I might say, well, how does that break down by site? And I can click on it. I can see some text about how to interpret it. But I might want to go looking by site. Okay, so now I can see the 5 sites that are involved, and I can see the Australian site, which has been our pet one to develop our model on. We do quite well on, surprise, surprise. But this is Walnut Gulch, I think. We really don't do very well. I can look at other metrics that go specifically for sensible heat. I can look at what each of the individual metrics said and how I did in terms of independent normalized metric value across all of the sites for each metric. But then I can go down and say, okay, let's look at that site that was causing the problem. Okay, so here's the site. Yes, sensible heat is atrocious there. Latent heat and kinetic system exchange are okay. What if I go to sensible heat by itself? What can I look at? I can look at the individual metric values that come out of sensible heat, and sure enough, the only thing that looks any good is the difference in the 5th percentile and the overlap of the density estimates. And there's not much difference between configuration 1 of the trunk and configuration 1 of my branch, configuration 2 of the trunk, configuration 2 of my branch. I've made no difference whatsoever, and I can see that. Maybe a slight difference here, not much. But then you can also look at particular things like time series plots or the things that I showed you before. Diurnal cycles or annual cycles. There's a whole lot of, or scatter plots. There's a whole lot of things that we're migrating into the system. Okay, so let's leave that. So that's the system where it ends up. And the idea here is within this modelevaluation.org system, we can put whatever analysis engine we want. What I was just showing you there is the Plumber PALs, the Plumber R scripts. ILAM is running within that system as well. ESM-Valtool is not yet, and MetPlus is not yet. These others are not. But the system is designed to be pretty flexible. As soon as we can get these working on the supercomputer, they are available as analysis engines within the system. So that allows us to, within this modelevaluation.org, manage the relationship between data provenance and versioning and the model repository version and which analysis has contributed to which kind of evaluation, how the empirical benchmarks were set up, and all that kind of information is all keyed in together. It's currently running at the National Computational Infrastructure in Canberra with HPC on the back end, but it could be mirrored in other places and could run on other supercomputers if there is a will locally to get that running on those supercomputers, obviously. A bit of a side note in that we've been working with the FluxNet people to put a bit of a pipeline in here so that updates to FluxNet data, many of you are probably aware that there will be another FluxNet release any day now, in theory, in time for AGU. It may be earlier next year, but it's soon. But you may not be aware that that will be the last one. And after that, they are moving to a system where data gets pushed as site PIs update that data. So, oops, let's go forward. I've entirely lost my mouse. Okay, so you may be aware that there's a system OneFlux that they use to process the flux tower data, and that ancillary information ends up in something called a BATM or a BIF file. You might have come across those. But what we're trying to do via the API and modelevaluation.org is when a new version of site data arrives, that's automatically pushed up to modelevaluation.org, which creates a provenance and ancillary data rich NetCDF version of the flux tower data. That has additional quality control and gap filling for land model application using the FluxNet LSM package that's in R that Anna Ukala wrote. And we get tower site profile and data plots generated for each new version. There's an example of a dataset page on the right for Tumbarumba that we talked about before. But also as a result of that, we get plots coming out that just show you what is going on with the actual flux tower data, and the versioning information is kept and becomes part of the analysis that is run with that site. Okay, and the last part there is that we are actually trying to push back that analysis information and feedback from modeling users to site PIs, which is trying to get these communities a little closer to each other. So last slide, we will have time. Conclusions. mechanistic land models, and I call them mechanistic rather than physically based because I think there wasn't enough data around when most of the parameterizations were developed to call them physically based, including land surface models, are outperformed by relatively simple, out of sample, empirical and machine learning models in a broad range of metrics. This is a controversial statement, but and it's not saying that these things are not important, but it's an important point to realize that for the level of fidelity that we have now in flux prediction, our models needn't have any representation of vegetation and soil. We could build a model that's mechanistic and is nominally a physically based model that knows nothing about vegetation or soil and could give better, higher fidelity predictions than what we have at the moment. So that is what machine learning has managed to demonstrate to us. It lets us understand exactly how much better we should expect land models to be and in which circumstances we should expect them to be better. And without it, we wouldn't even know that there is a problem to solve. So in my mind, the first step to resolving these issues is for the community to build a fast, comprehensive, interpretable testing platform that allows these techniques to be embedded in it. And I really think that is the only way we are going to avoid these problems in future. And that is all I have to say.
Yeah, thanks so much, Gab. That was a really super presentation. It was so clear and yeah, really nice stuff. I mean, the tools look so useful as well. I mean, like trying to be able to kind of get that so automated is should be super useful, right? Let me see if there's any questions in the chat. If not, oh yes, yeah, we have one. So Matthias asks, thanks, Grab, for the great talk. Would it be a good idea to have output of an LSTM, for example, as part of the FluxNet data files?
Um, Matthias, feel free to unmic if you can, but are you suggesting that a prediction of the fluxes based on the meteorology at that site? I'm not sure if we can hear him.
Yeah, I don't know if we can
My
unmute
answer,
him to speak.
Matthias, would be the difficulty is that the way these empirical models, a key part of the empirical of the machine learning is that they are trained on other sites and then taken to a site they haven't seen to do the prediction. So to do that, for each site that you want to make one of these predictions, you have to keep a bank of other sites that you train the machine learning model and then bring it to the site you want to do that for. But in effect, that's what we're going to be providing on this platform is each time there's a data set update, we will regenerate those machine learning models and fluxes for that site. And we could host that with the data set. At the moment, it's just being hosted in the experiments, but it could be hosted with the data set for sure.
No, perfect. Yeah, thanks, Gab. So Eleanor has her hand up, and I think I can allow her to talk. So I'll unmute you, Eleanor, and you feel free to go ahead.
Hi, Gav, thanks so much. You talked before, but I guess one thing I'd like to, I wonder if you might have a go, whether you've got a hunch of why the sensible heat flux is so bad in our models. As you know, I'm looking at the turbulent exchange, the Z0T value, or whatever version of that you call, so the reference length for temperature. But what do you think it might be? What do you think?
I wish I had a good answer for you. I know we talked about this when I was there in May, but I wish I had a good answer. I mean, I really didn't come to this with a background in land surface processes. I came to this as a sort of with severe imposter syndrome to this community, but with a mathematics background, and I sort of thought, okay, machine learning, I can handle that. I know how to do that. And so it was. I don't really know. I suspect you could give a better answer than I could, Eleanor.
Well, I mean, I find it a really fascinating topic. I certainly think that the evaporation has an internal constraint to it. So that's why it performs reasonably well, because there's only so much water and so much energy, and the evaporation tends to dominate, it'll grab the energy when it needs to do the evaporation, leaving behind, certainly in the land surface models, if you like, the sensible heat flux is the I don't know I can't what the word we use, but it's soaking up all the errors in everything else. There's no constraint on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've also seen some of the things I presented previously on ground heat flux, which looks equally problematic. So between those two, something is not NQR.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it could be about turbulence as well, obviously.
Could be turbulence or ground heat, yeah. So it would be good to have yeah, anyway, so I guess it'd be quite interesting to see where it fails more. Is it in very sparse, hot, dry regions, or is it when there's a lot of water around? Or
Yeah.
I'm not going to do it myself, but I'm just hoping people might be inspired
So
to.
my plan is really just to set up this testing environment and then try and prosecute the case for us as a community to adopt something like this. So those questions are more easily investigated.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I agree. Thank you so much. It's great.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks, Eleanor. I mean, yeah, one from me as well, maybe. I mean, you sort of saying, Gab, that in your opinion, the models that we currently have are more mechanistic than kind of physical models. And now that we have all this data, like you say, that potentially when we were developing these models wasn't available, what's your kind of opinion in how we do go past that and move on to kind of a more physically based model? Is it having kind of some learned representations of these parameters from the data, or what's
It,
your
it,
opinion?
uh, my opinion is predictable, which is first of all build the test bed. Like if you were developing a complicated piece of software, you build the tests and what it has to do first to see whether it does it. And
Mm.
then if you're really naive like me and don't know much about these physical processes, then you can just kind of have some steps in the dark and see what gets you somewhere, of course. But there are people with a whole lot more expertise than me to try and do that.
Mm.
Um, but there is an argument in my mind, given that we have such highly parameterized land models, um, where arguably, at least not in terms of all applications, but in terms of the fidelity of flux prediction, they should not be that complicated because we don't
Yes.
need all that information. And in fact, if we can't prescribe it accurately, there's an argument to say that it is not going to be possible for us to do an accurate prediction with a model that's that complicated if we can't prescribe the parameters. So there's an argument to say, how many dimensions of actual data do I have in the predictive environment to constrain parameters? And that's roughly the number of degrees of freedom I should have in the model. So
Yes. Yeah.
there's an argument possibly for starting from data, but that
Yep.
will change over time as well.
So a bit more of a, yeah, simple is better, Occam's razor kind of potentially.
Well, yeah, we tend not to employ, we tend to say, oh, if I had termites in my model, I could then have this
Yes.
other stream of data that I could bring in. If I had this, I could, and so we have lots of hooks into different things,
Mm.
but we don't really have a test for parsimony, right? So we don't really have
Yeah.
something that says, well, the cost of those extra degrees of freedom that you're adding in is too high.
No, no, definitely. Yeah, I
We've
completely
never had a
agree.
test like that, and I think
Yeah.
that's cost us.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think, yeah, I think the interpretability of some of these models, like you said, the parameter space is so large that I mean, it's kind of it's hard to unpick even why they're doing specific things, right? And like you say, that's why maybe building the test bed like you've presented is such an important thing as well. Because I mean, it's even with sometimes like we say with the data driven models that you've shown with the training in LSTM. I mean, sometimes maybe it's just as interpretable as some of the land surface models, right? You can point to exactly why it's made that prediction because of the input data that you've given it. Whereas for our land surface models,
Yeah, I mean, the
occasionally
other
it could
approach
be.
would be to take a land surface model. And the
Mm.
difficulty with building an entirely empirical land model that's kind of mechanistic and machine learning based is we have
Mm.
very few measurements of the bits in between. So we have the meteorological data and we have the fluxes, and
Yes.
we have maybe like, you know, 3 months of sat flow data or,
Yeah. Yeah.
bits
Yeah.
and pieces here and there, but we can't really construct a machine learning model that goes from step A to step B, from step B to step C, from step C to, and then say, all of those are physically meaningful variables because we don't have the data to drive it.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
You could, for example, take a land surface model and say, well, let's just go to the point where we've got this derived variable, and from here on, we'll employ machine learning. Can it get there?
Yes.
And try it at different steps to try and work out which one of those might be causing the problem. Might be. I mean, it's all going to be specific to one model, but it's possible.
Yeah. 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 No. No. Yeah. Thanks, Gab.
It's a lot of
Um.
work.
Yes. Yes. Indeed. Yeah. 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 So, yeah. Do we have any other questions? Let me have a look. So, in the Q&A, I think we've answered that one. Did anyone else want to raise their hand at all? And I can unmute you, or if not, we can think about wrapping up.
Sounds good.
Yeah, well, doesn't look like we've got any other hands raised. So yeah, thanks so much again, Gab. It was, yeah, super clear and really interesting presentation. Really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for joining. And I guess we'll have emails sent around about next time. And I think there was a question about sharing the recording and potentially the slides, and I'm sure that will be done as well. I'm sure Shannon will be on the case. Yeah, thanks very much everyone, and yeah, thanks again to Gab. Really good. Cheers.
Thanks for hosting, Ewan.
Yeah. Cheers,
Take
guys.
care.
Bye.